3 little girls sold their cat for bread, until a lonely widow gave them a forever home. The forgotten alley was a kingdom of shadows, a place that smelled of quiet desperation, fierce loyalty, and the cold dust of a town with no pity. Elara, all of 12 years old, clutched their last bit of warmth, a tiny black kitten named Soot. She listened to the soft breathing of her sleeping sisters, Tess and Pip, revealing a maturity far beyond her years. But the traitorous rumble in her own belly revealed the conflict that was tearing her apart. She was their protector, the girl forced to become a woman overnight, clinging to a secret heartbreaking plan. Soot purred against her ribs, a tiny engine of trust, oblivious to the fact that he was their only asset left. He was family. But you can't eat family, not when the chips are down. To give her sisters one more meal, she would have to sell their only friend. What would you trade for survival? And when you sell a piece of your own heart, what do you get in return? Dust was the first thing Elara tasted each morning. It was the flavor of their lives, a fine gray powder that settled on everything in the forgotten corner of the stable they called home. It coated the splintered planks of the walls, dulled the slivers of morning light that pierced the gloom, and dusted the sleeping faces of her sisters. From her perch on a pile of old burlap sacks, Elara watched them, a 12-year-old general surveying her tiny, slumbering army. Tess and Pip were a tangle of limbs under a single threadbare blanket, their breath rising in soft, unified puffs of white in the cold air. Tess, with her face of impossible dreams, and Pip, whose small hand was curled into a fist as if clutching onto the last remnants of a meal she'd had only in her sleep. They were her world. They were her burden. They were the promise she had made to her mother in a whisper, a promise that now felt like a millstone around her neck. A flicker of bright, living flame moved in her lap. Cinder. He was a scrap of sunset, a tiny tiger made of orange fire and boundless trust. They had found him near the blacksmith's forge, a shivering ball of fluff, and had smuggled him back to their kingdom of shadows. Now he was its only light. He kneaded his small paws into the thin fabric of Elara's dress, his purr a low rumbling engine of contentment that vibrated through her own empty belly. He was warmth. He was life. He was everything they were not. The hunger was a patient beast. It had been whispering to her for days, a hollow ache that started deep inside and radiated outward, making the world seem pale and distant. She was used to her own hunger. She could command it, push it down into a dark corner and ignore it. But she could not ignore the sounds her sisters made. Pip whimpered a soft, heartbreaking sound. Her small body stirred and she murmured a single, dreamy word. Cake. The word so innocent and impossible was a knife in Elara's heart. There was no cake. There was no bread. There was no anything. The handful of beans they had shared yesterday was a distant memory. A ghost of a meal. Tess stirred at the sound, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Elara, and her face, usually so full of resilient hope, was clouded with the familiar weary question of the morning. She didn't have to ask. The answer was in the bare-planked corner that served as their larder. It was in the hollow feeling behind Elara's ribs. Tess's gaze fell to the kitten purring in Elara's lap. She reached out a finger and stroked Cinder's bright fur. At least he's warm, she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. Elara looked down at the small creature. He was more than warm. He was fat. He was healthy. He spent his days chasing dust motes, and his nights curled with them a tiny living furnace. He did not know hunger. He did not know fear. He knew only the gentle hands that fed him the occasional scrap they couldn't spare, but gave him anyway the soft voices that whispered his name. And that was when the idea, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, lodged itself in her mind. It was a terrible thought, a betrayal of the one bright thing in their lives. She tried to push it away, to banish it. She looked around their shelter, her eyes scanning desperately for another solution. The cracked water bucket, the worn-out blanket, the clothes on their backs. Nothing. They had nothing of value, nothing anyone would trade for even a stale crust of bread. Nothing except him. Nothing except the small, trusting orange life purring in her lap. Her stomach clenched a vicious, painful knot. This was a new kind of hunger, a hunger for a different path, for any other choice but this one. But there was no other choice. She looked at Pip's sleeping face, at the faint bluish tint of cold on her lips. She looked at Tess, who was watching her, whose own face was a mirror of the same grim calculation, the same dawning horror. The kitten Cinder stretched luxuriously, yawned a wide, pink yawn, and settled back to sleep utterly secure in the love that surrounded him. Elara felt a tear, hot and unwanted, spill over and trace a cold path down her cheek. In the quiet of the stable, a new and terrible silence fell, the silence of a choice that had not yet been spoken, but which was already breaking her heart. The idea once formed was a living thing in the small cold shed. It sat between them, ugly and undeniable, poisoning the quiet air. Elara felt Tess's horrified gaze on her, but she could not meet it. To look at her sister would be to see her own monstrous thought reflected, and she wasn't sure she could bear it. Instead, she focused on a spider web in the corner, a delicate silver trap shimmering in a stray beam of light. A trap. That's what this was. "No," Tess whispered, her voice trembling, giving sound to the horror. "You can't be thinking it. You can't." Elara finally forced herself to look away from the web. She looked at her sister, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "There's nothing else, Tess. You know there isn't. Look around us." Her gesture took in the whole of their bleak kingdom, the empty corner that was their pantry, the threadbare blanket, the cracked water bucket. Hope is not a currency they accept at the general store, but he's not a thing to be sold. Tess's voice rose a mixture of anguish and disbelief. She scrambled over to Elara, pulling the purring kitten into her own arms, holding him like a shield. "He's Cinder. He's our Cinder. We can find work. I can sweep floors. You can mend clothes. We've done it before. For a penny a day." Elara's voice was flat, brutal, with a truth she hated. "A penny won't buy a loaf of bread, and you know it. The winter is coming. The jobs are gone. There is only the hunger, and it is getting worse." She softened her tone, the hardness of the general giving way to the pain of the sister. "I know you love him. I love him too." She watched as Cinder, nestled in Tess's arms, began to playfully bat at a loose strand of her brown hair. A perfect, innocent moment in the middle of their ugly, impossible choice. But love can't fill our stomachs. It can't keep Pip warm. At the mention of her name, Pip, who had been watching them with wide, confused eyes, crawled over and tugged on Elara's sleeve. "I'm hungry, Elara," she said, her voice small and clear, a simple statement of fact that was more powerful than any argument. "My tummy hurts." That was it, the final blow. Tess looked from Elara's grim face to Pip's pale one. She saw the dark circles under her little sister's eyes, the listless way she leaned against Elara for support. The fight went out of her, extinguished like a candle flame in a hard wind. Her shoulders slumped. The fierce protectiveness in her eyes gave way to a deep, bottomless ocean of sorrow. She looked down at the orange kitten in her lap. He was the embodiment of their carefree days, a remnant of a time before the cold, and the hunger had become their constant companions. He was the last piece of their childhood, and she had to let him go. He would have a warm home. Tess asked, her voice barely audible, a last desperate plea for some kind of comfort in the betrayal. Elara knotted her own throat tight. A fireplace, a saucer of milk every morning, a soft lap to sleep on. He would be happy, Tess. He would be safe. Safer than us, she thought. She held her sister's gaze, trying to pour all the strength she had into it. "I promised," Mama Elara whispered the words meant only for Tess. "I promised I would keep you both safe. Safe means fed. Safe means alive. This is the only way." Tess hugged Cinder close one last time, burying her face in his bright, soft fur. Elara could feel the shudder that ran through her small body. Finally, after a long, heartbreaking moment, Tess looked up. Her face was a ruin of tear tracks and dust, but in her eyes there was a terrible, resolute acceptance. She held the kitten out to Elara. "All right," she choked out. The word was the saddest sound Elara had ever heard. Taking Cinder from Tess's arms was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was so light, so warm, his purr a gentle vibration against her own aching heart. He looked up at her, his green eyes full of unwavering trust. For a moment she wanted to scream, to throw him back at Tess and say it was a mistake, that they would find another way. But she looked at Pip, who was now watching her with hopeful eyes, and she knew there was no other way. She stood up, the small, warm weight in her arms, feeling heavier than the entire world. "Get your shawls," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the suddenly vast and empty shed. "We'll go now, before we lose our nerve." The main street of Dust Devil Gulch was a river of noise and indifference, and the three of them were little more than pebbles in its current. Elara walked with her chin held high, a general leading a somber funereal procession. She held Cinder tucked inside her own worn jacket, his small warm body a secret against her thudding heart. Beside her, Tess was a ghost, her feet shuffling, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground as if searching for something she had already lost. Pip, holding Elara's other hand, was the only one who looked at the world with any curiosity. Her small face turned toward the wonders of the town. A passing horse. A woman in a fine blue dress, the tantalizing smell of frying meat from the saloon. Elara felt the weight of their journey in every step. Each storefront they passed, with its promise of goods and comfort, was a testament to all they did not have. This was a world built on coin and commerce, and they were bankrupt in every sense of the word. Her destination was the largest building on the street, Gable's general store and mercantile. Its windows were a universe of impossible treasures. She could see barrels of flour, sacks of coffee beans, and glinting on a high shelf a row of glass jars filled with colorful candy shining like jewels. A bell, bright and cheerful, announced their entry. The sound was a jarring lie. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, complicated sense of civilization. Coffee and cured tobacco leather and lye soap sugar and spice. It was the smell of life, of plenty, and it made Elara feel dizzy with want. Mr. Gable, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched from tasting lemons, stood behind a long wooden counter measuring out flour for a customer. He glanced up as they entered, his gaze sweeping over their ragged forms with an expression that landed somewhere between impatience and disgust. Elara waited, her heart hammering. She felt Tess shrink behind her, trying to make herself invisible. When the other customer had paid and left, she took a deep breath, the air tasting of coffee and her own fear, and stepped forward. She gently brought Cinder out from her jacket. The kitten blinked in the dim light, a brilliant splash of orange against the gloom. "Mr. Gable," she began, her voice small but clear, "I have this kitten for sale." Gable stopped what he was doing and stared first at the cat, then at her. A look of profound irritation settled on his sour features. "For sale," he repeated, his voice a dry rasp. "Child, do I look like I'm in the business of livestock? This is a mercantile, not a petting zoo. I've got enough trouble with mice without adding a cat to the payroll." He flapped a hand at them. "Now run along. I've got inventory to take." The rejection was a physical blow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elara. This was her only plan, her only hope. She could feel Tess begin to tremble beside her, a strange, terrible mixture of relief and despair. "What have you got there, child?" The voice was quiet calm, and it came from the corner of the store. A woman in a simple black dress stood there, a basket over her arm. It was Mrs. Evelyn Reed, the widow who lived in the small, neat house at the end of town. She was a quiet figure, rarely seen, a woman who seemed to carry her own private cloud of sorrow with her wherever she went. She stepped forward, her movements graceful. She knelt, bringing herself down to their level, her dark, sad eyes looking not with pity, but with a gentle, genuine curiosity. Elara held Cinder out a little further. "He's for sale, ma'am." Mrs. Reed looked at the kitten, then at the three girls. She saw Elara's fierce, desperate pride. She saw Pip's innocent, hungry face, and she saw Tess's eyes red-rimmed and brimming with a grief so large it seemed too big for her small body to contain. "I see," Mrs. Reed said softly. She reached out a hand, not to take the kitten, but to gently stroke the top of his head. Cinder, traitor that he was, leaned into her touch and began to purr. "He's a handsome fellow, very bright." She looked at Elara. "How much are you asking for him?" "5 cents, Elara whispered. "I'll give you 10, Mrs. Reed said, without a moment's hesitation. She opened her small black reticule. "A fine cat like this is worth at least 10 cents. It was happening. It was real. Elara looked at her sister. It was time. "Tess," she prompted, her voice tight. Tess took a shuddering breath. She stepped forward and held Cinder out. For one last agonizing moment, she pressed her cheek against his soft orange fur, her eyes squeezed shut. Then, her hands trembling, she placed her friend, her companion, her last bit of warmth into the outstretched hands of the stranger. The transfer was made. Tess's arms fell to her sides empty. Mrs. Reed cradled Cinder as if he were made of spun glass. She smiled, a sad, gentle curve of her lips. "He'll have a good home with me," she promised, looking directly at Tess. "There's a warm hearth and plenty of cream." She then turned to Elara and placed 2 heavy silver dimes into her small, outstretched palm. The metal was cold and real. It was the weight of their survival. It was the weight of their betrayal. "Thank you, ma'am," Elara managed to say. She took Tess by the hand and turned to leave. The bell above the door jingled their departure. They stood for a moment on the dusty boardwalk, the sounds of the store fading behind them. The world looked the same, but everything had changed. The silver was cold and heavy in Elara's hand, a stark and final proof that to save a life she had been forced to break a heart. And she was not entirely sure it was not her own. The 2 silver dimes in Elara's palm were the heaviest things in the world. They were colder than the river water, heavier than the promise she carried. They were the price of a purr, the cost of a friend. She curled her fingers around them, the sharp, milled edges digging into her skin, and led her sisters away from the general store, away from the scene of their quiet, necessary crime. Their destination was the bakery at the far end of the street. Long before they saw it, they could smell it. A warm, golden cloud of baking bread, of yeast and heat and life itself, a scent so overwhelmingly wonderful it was a kind of pain. It made the hunger, which had been momentarily forgotten in the shock of their grief, return with a ferocious, clawing intensity. Elara pushed open the bakery door. Here there was no judgment, only the enveloping warmth from the great brick oven and the kind, flour-dusted face of the baker's wife. Elara did not have to speak. Her eyes wide and desperate did the talking. She pointed a small trembling finger at a large round loaf cooling on the rack, its crust a perfect burnished brown. She opened her fist and laid the 2 silver coins on the counter. The woman's eyes softened with a sad understanding. She took the coins without a word and wrapped the loaf in a sheet of clean brown paper. The loaf was warm. It radiated a living heat that seeped through the paper, warming Elara's cold hands. It was the warmest thing she had held since Cinder. She clutched it to her chest like a fragile, precious thing and herded her sisters back toward the shadows. They did not run. They walked, with a strange solemn dignity, 3 mourners carrying the bounty from a funeral. Back in the cold shelter of the abandoned shed, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the 3 of them and the bread. Elara sat on the floor, her back against the rough wall, and placed the loaf in the center of their small circle. She carefully unwrapped it, the crinkling of the paper a loud reverent sound. Steam, fragrant and beautiful, escaped and vanished in the cold air like a fleeting ghost. She broke the loaf. The sound of the crust crackling was magnificent. She gave the first largest piece to Tess. The second piece, nearly as large, went to Pip. She took the smallest piece for herself. For a moment there was nothing but the pure animal bliss of appeasing a great hunger. The bread was heaven. It was crisp on the outside, soft and doughy within. It was the taste of safety, of survival. Elara closed her eyes, chewing slowly, letting the simple, profound pleasure of a full stomach wash over her. She had done it. She had saved them. But the feeling did not last. As the desperate edge of her hunger faded, another emptiness, colder and more vast, took its place. She opened her eyes. Pip had already devoured her portion and was looking around, her small brow furrowed in confusion. Tess was eating her piece with a slowness that was agonizing, her small jaw working mechanically. Tears were rolling silently down her cheeks, dropping onto the bread in her hands, seasoning it with salt and sorrow. "Where's Cinder?" Pip asked, her voice small and clear in the quiet shed. "Is he comin' to have some?" Tess let out a small, choked sob, and quickly looked away, hiding her face in the crook of her arm. Elara swallowed a mouthful of bread that had suddenly turned to sawdust in her mouth. She reached out and pulled Pip close. "Cinder has a new home now." "Pip," she said, her voice thick. "Remember, a warm home, with a fireplace." Pip considered this for a moment. "Will he come visit? Maybe someday." Elara lied. The lie was a bitter taste, far worse than the hunger had ever been. The rest of the meal was eaten in silence. The magnificent bread now tasted of nothing at all. It was just something to be chewed and swallowed, a chore to be completed. The warmth in their bellies did little to fight the chill that had settled deep in their bones. A chill that came from an empty space in their small circle, a space that had once been filled by a vibrant, orange, purring life. When the last crumb was gone, the paper lay discarded and empty between them. Their hunger was sated. Her promise was kept. But the silence in the shed was a new kind of emptiness, a new kind of hunger. And as Elara pulled the threadbare blanket over her 2 sleeping sisters, she had no idea how or if they would ever be full again. Evelyn Reed's house was a world of profound and orderly silence. It was a silence she had curated over 5 long years, a silence built from the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, the soft tick of the mantel clock, and the hollow echo of her own solitary footsteps on the polished floorboards. It was the silence of a life pared down to its essentials, a fortress built to keep the sharp, unpredictable edges of the world at bay. Grief was a quiet guest in this house. It did not scream, but it was always present, seated in the empty chair across from her at the dinner table. Today, however, the silence was broken. A tiny, vibrant splash of orange chaos had been unleashed upon her quiet world. Cinder. He batted at the tassels of her shawl, his claws making tiny snagging sounds. He chased a sunbeam across the floor with the unthinking, joyful ferocity of youth. He was a whirlwind of life, a tiny, purring engine of undeniable presence, and with every playful pounce he chipped away at the serene, sorrowful stillness of her home. Evelyn sat in her rocking chair by the window, a book lying open and unread in her lap. She watched the kitten, but she did not see him. Instead, she saw the faces of the 3 girls at the general store. She saw the fierce, desperate pride in the oldest one's eyes, a look that was far too old for a child. She saw the youngest's wide, hungry gaze. But most of all, she saw the middle girl, Tess, and the moment the kitten had left her arms. She had seen the light go out of the child's eyes, a look of such utter and complete devastation that it had followed Evelyn all the way home. It was the look of a heart breaking. She knew that look. She had seen it in her own mirror every morning for years. She had told herself it was a kindness. She had paid a fair price. The kitten would have a good home. She had done more than most. The justifications were neat, logical, and utterly useless against the memory of those eyes. She looked around her clean, quiet, empty house. There was a warm fire in the hearth. There was a pot of savory stew simmering on the stove, enough for 3 meals for herself. The house had never felt so empty. The silence had never been so loud. Cinder, having exhausted himself, leaped onto her lap, curled into a tight orange ball, and began to purr. The small vibrating warmth against her was a comfort, but it was also an accusation. This warmth, this life had been purchased, and the sellers were now somewhere out in the cold, their hunger sated for a day perhaps, but their hearts left colder than ever. The sun began to dip below the rooftops of Dust Devil Gulch, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and rose. The wind picked up a low, mournful sound that rattled the window pane. It was the sound of a lonely night approaching. A cold night. Cold. Evelyn Reed closed her book. She could not read. She could not sit. She could not be the kind of person who saw a child's heart break and did nothing more than go home to her quiet, orderly life. Her grief had made her a recluse, but it had not yet turned her to stone. She stood the decision made not in her head, but in her soul. It was a simple, undeniable truth. She could not. She put on her heaviest shawl, her movements now filled with a purpose that had been absent for years. She gently scooped the sleeping kitten into the crook of her arm, his warmth a small living ember against the black of her dress. He was the bridge. He was the offering. She stepped out into the twilight. The town was shutting down, for the night lights appearing in windows, the boisterous sounds from the saloon spilling into the street. She walked against the current of men heading for drink and warmth, a solitary figure on a mission no one else would understand. She asked a man, leaving the blacksmith's, "Have you seen 3 little girls, sisters?" He just shook his head and hurried on. She searched the main street, her steps quickening as the temperature dropped. The alleys were dark, filled with shadows that looked like monsters. She was about to give up, to retreat back to the safety of her home, when a thought occurred to her. Where does one go when there is nowhere to go, to the most forgotten place of all? She made her way to the abandoned stable at the far edge of town. It was a skeletal collapsing structure, a place of ghosts and decay. Peering into the deep shadows of an attached, open-faced shed, she saw nothing at first but a heap of rags and old burlap sacks. She almost turned away. Then a flicker of movement. Cinder, awake now in her arms, let out a soft, questioning meow. From the pile of rags, a small head lifted. Elara, her eyes wide and fierce in the gloom, fixed on Evelyn. Evelyn's own eyes adjusted. She saw it all now. Not a pile of rags, but 3 small bodies huddled together like puppies for warmth. Pip and Tess still fast asleep. She saw the profound, heartbreaking reality of their existence. She took a slow step forward, her heart aching. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper so as not to frighten them. I believe you lost something." She held Cinder out a tiny beacon of orange fur in the encroaching darkness. Elara shot to her feet, a tiny, fierce sentinel in the gloom, pushing her sisters behind her. The woman in black stood at the edge of their shelter, a phantom in the encroaching night, holding their heart in her arms. Cinder let out another soft meow, a sound of recognition, of comfort that felt like a betrayal. "What do you want?" Elara's voice was a low growl, the sound of a cornered animal protecting its young. The world had taught her that nothing was free, that kindness was just a mask for some other sharper motive. "The widow misses," Reed did not flinch from her hostility. She took a slow, deliberate step closer, her sad eyes holding Elara's gaze. There was no pity in them, only a profound and weary understanding. "My house is very quiet," Mrs. Reed said, her voice as soft as the falling dusk, "and the stew I made is far too much for just one person." She looked down at the kitten in her arms. "And this little fellow, he seems to believe he belongs with you." At that moment, Tess, who had been frozen in a state of shock, finally found her voice. A single, whispered word full of hope and disbelief. Cinder. The kitten's head perked up at the sound of his name. He squirmed in Mrs. Reed's arms, his bright orange fur a beacon in the shadows. He wanted to go to Tess. Elara's fierce protective stance wavered. She watched the woman searching for the trick, the hidden angle, but there was none. There was only a quiet loneliness that she recognized, for it was a mirror of her own. She saw the genuine sorrow in the woman's eyes, and she understood. This was not charity. This was a reaching out of one empty soul to 3 others. Mrs. Reed took another step. She gently placed Cinder on the ground. The kitten, without a moment's hesitation, darted across the cold earth and rubbed against Tess's legs, purring like a tiny thunderstorm. Tess let out a sob of pure joy and scooped him up, burying her face in his fur. The sight of it, the simple, unadulterated rightness of it, broke the last of Elara's defenses. "Come," Mrs. Reed said softly. "Just for the night. A warm meal and a safe place to sleep. That's all I offer." Elara looked at Tess, whose face was radiant with a happiness she hadn't seen in a year. She looked at Pip, who was now awake and staring with wide, curious eyes at the kind woman. She looked at the dark, cold night that was settling around them, a night that promised a chill that went deeper than bone. She had fought so hard to keep them alive, but this woman was offering them a chance to live. She gave a single, slow nod. The walk to Mrs. Reed's house was a journey from one world to another. They left the decay and the shadows of the stable behind and walked through the town's main street toward a small house with a single, warm, yellow light shining in the window. A beacon. Tess clutched Cinder the entire way, a treasure restored. Elara walked beside Mrs. Reed, not yet touching, but feeling the invisible warmth of her presence beside them. The house was small, but it was immaculate. It smelled of beeswax and dried lavender and the rich, savory promise of beef stew. A fire crackled merrily in a clean-swept stone hearth. A colorful patchwork quilt was draped over a rocking chair. It was a temple of warmth and order and care. Mrs. Reed led them to a small wooden table already set with 3 bowls. She ladled the thick, fragrant stew, the steam rising to fog the cold window panes. She placed a bowl before each of them along with a thick slice of buttered bread. For a moment, they just stared. It was a feast, a dream. "Go on," Mrs. Reed urged, her voice gentle. "Eat before it gets cold." Pip was the first, dipping her spoon in with childish eagerness. Tess was next. Elara took the first spoonful, and the warmth that spread through her was more than just the heat of the stew. It was the warmth of safety. The taste was rich and deep, the taste of a home she had only a faint memory of. This was not the tasteless dinner of the night before. This meal was seasoned with kindness. She watched her sisters eat, their faces glowing in the firelight. She saw Pip, with a small smudge of gravy on her cheek, already nodding off to sleep in her chair, her small belly full for the first time in a long time. She saw Tess, one hand stroking Cinder, who was curled and purring in her lap, the other holding her spoon, her face a perfect picture of contentment. The meal was over. Pip had fallen asleep, her head pillowed on her arms at the table, a blissful, full-bellied sleep. Tess was curled up on the rug by the fire, Cinder, a warm orange ball on her lap, both lost to the world. Elara remained at the table, a half-empty bowl before her, simply watching the firelight dance on her sisters' peaceful faces. The fierce, vigilant general inside her was finally cautiously standing down. Mrs. Reed moved quietly from the hearth and came to stand behind her. She placed a gentle hand on Elara's shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like an anchor holding her steady in a world that had suddenly stopped spinning. "You're safe now, child," the widow whispered. The simple words spoken with such quiet certainty were an absolution. Elara looked up at her, and all the questions, all the fears of the morning to come, coalesced into a single whispered question of her own, a question she was almost too terrified to ask. For how long? Mrs. Reed's eyes, so full of their own old sorrows, softened. She looked from Elara to the two sleeping girls, and a small, sad, sweet smile touched her lips. "I lost my family in this house," she said, her voice thick with a memory Elara could only guess at. "My husband and our little girl. For a long time this has just been a house full of echoes." She looked back at Elara, and the warmth in her gaze was a tangible thing, a promise. "Tonight, you three, you've filled it with life again. You've made it a home." She squeezed Elara's shoulder gently. "It will be your home for as long as you will have it. For always, if you'll let it be." The words were more than a promise. They were a foundation, a place to build a new life upon. Elara stared at her, and the fierce protective walls she had built so high and so strong for so long finally came crumbling down. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or of grief or of fear. It was a tear of relief. She was home. They were all home. The promise to her mother had been kept. And here, in the gentle crackling quiet of the firelight, as she looked at the woman who would be their mother, a new and brighter one was just beginning.